Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. That's great. Looks like most people have gone and filled this out. So it looks like y'all are really big on Python, Java, and C, which makes sense because those are the languages taught at UCF. We have some Fortran people. That's good to know. Wow, we actually have a lot of different languages too. This is pretty cool. Yeah, and so some Rob language. That's pretty quality. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and shut this down, but this is pretty interesting. Oh, thanks Eli for setting that up. Okay, so I'm Rob. I'm on the dev team here at NightHacks. I love JavaScript, definitely my favorite language. And you are at Intro to JavaScript. So if you meant to be the Intro to Python, you should still stay anyway because JavaScript's better than Python. But you are at the Intro to JavaScript workshop. We're gonna try to get through as much stuff as we possibly can. So we're gonna write basically. This is the app we're gonna build. Basically, it grabs random images of food from the internet, which is beautiful, and it has like these nice little buttons. And this is all it does, but it has basically, you're going to learn the components of front end JavaScript as well as back end. We're not going to be able to get into mobile, but if you do want to get into that, head over to like the React workshop that's later today, or it might be tomorrow. The React workshop, and then you can get into React Native and you can start writing mobile apps with JavaScript. So that's definitely, especially for hackathons, that's a great way to do things. If you do have questions throughout, please ask them. I monitor the chat like very regularly. And if people ask questions, it definitely makes the workshop better. Like I can talk for an hour. I said this before, I can talk for an hour straight, but I would appreciate if people like jump in and contribute different things. So to get started with this, we're just gonna, I strongly feel like the best way to learn something like JavaScript is just to start building stuff with it. You can like try to read tutorials, read the documentation. You can look at slides, but slides are boring. So what we're gonna do is just start building this app immediately. And if you have questions, like ask me and we figure it out. So I'm gonna paste this link to the source code for this demo in the chat. This is actually just a template, so it doesn't include any JavaScript. So all we have here is the base HTML, which is only 20 lines, and some CSS to make it look pretty. If you're not familiar with kind of web languages, HTML basically gives you the structure of a document. So you can see like we have our buttons, our 2 buttons for the page, we have an image, and then we also have a section for some text. And that's our whole document there. CSS is used for styling, so that's what makes it look pretty. It does all the things like when you hover over the button, you get like a little color, right? So if you hover this, you might see, you kind of get that nice indicator. Even changing the pointer, that's all CSS. And then we are going to write in JavaScript. So you can go ahead and download this. You can just follow along with me here. So you can just open up your terminal. If you have Git installed, you'll just be able to clone it with this command. So just git clone and then that URL. Otherwise, if you just head over to GitHub, if you're not familiar with GitHub or you've never used it before, have no idea what's going on with that, that's fine. Just head over here, click this big code button, and then download zip. And this will just give you a zip file that you can extract, and it will have all of this, all these files inside of it. And then you can just start working straight out of there. Open it up in VS Code or whatever editor you use. Web is definitely a very friendly platform. You don't need a specific IDE or anything to get it to work. Okay, so let's head over into this file, and then let's start poking around here. So this is just our basic HTML file. HTML is going to describe the structure of your page. So you can see here's our buttons, previous, next. And then our JavaScript is actually loaded in a script tag. So this is how you run JavaScript on the front end. JavaScript is historically a front end only language. So when you hear people talk about like the front end and the back end, right? The front end is this part. It's the front because it's in the front because you can see it. The back end is kind of like the wiring in the background that maybe helps the whole thing work together. And so that you don't really see it as much. It's like what would process your payments. It's where data gets stored if you store information. All that kind of stuff's happening on the back end. So JavaScript was originally invented as a scripting language for the front end. But over time, people have decided they really like it. They want to port it to use it for other use cases. So there's a project called Node.js, and that basically took JavaScript and made it so you could use it on the back end, or even on the command line. So you can write like command line utilities with JavaScript. I've done like a little bit of that in the past. It works very well. So you can grab Node.js. We will be using this later to actually set up our backend. So if you want to head over to nodejs.org, let me send you the link for that. Install that. If you're on Mac or Linux, you can also install it through your favorite package manager. What is Node.js similar to React.js? So not quite. So Node.js is basically, it lets you run JavaScript outside of your browser. So again, the original use case of JavaScript was to have a front-end scripting language, something you could run in your browser. And over time, people are like, okay, we want to run JavaScript other places. We want to be able to run it on our servers. And so that's what Node.js does. React.js is basically a library for writing UIs. So we're not going to be using React in this workshop. You can do all the things React does, you can do yourself. You don't need React to build a UI or do anything like that. However, most projects these days are written with React because it makes it a lot easier to do certain things. So for a small demo like this, like it's definitely, you don't need to pull in React and all of that stuff and learn all of that just to get something basic working. But as you build more and more complicated projects, something like React is like super helpful and is definitely these days like the industry standard for writing a UI. JavaScript is definitely a language that has tons and tons and tons of libraries. So beyond just learning the language, we're going to be focusing on like learning the language, learning Node, kind of the different use cases. If you have other questions about like various, like, oh, I've heard of Vue, or I've heard of, you know, all these various Java, I've heard of jQuery, like what is that? I don't know. Like feel free to ask that and we can talk about that as we go through. It's a super confusing landscape with so many different things that are written with JavaScript. But what we're going to be doing today is basically just vanilla JavaScript and then some Node.js and Express at the end. Okay, for Node.js, can I also use the NPM for other stuff? Okay, so NPM, this is also something that's very confusing. Node.js, it was originally built for the back end, right? But nowadays, even front-end projects like React use it because it lets you install it's the way you install JavaScript libraries. So in like a language like C, if you want to like include a library, you just use like the hash include. Or if you have Java, most things are included in the standard library, but you might use something like Gradle or Maven, and right, you use something like that, and that lets you get other people's code. So instead of like building something from scratch yourself, you get other people's code. That's like using a library. NPM is basically the Node package manager. So that's for Java. It's basically, you could just consider it the JavaScript package manager. So if you want to use other people's code, and we will see some of that when we use Express.js here, then using NPM is what you're going to want to do. That's like the standard package manager. There's some other ones too, like Yarn, but they all use NPM under the hood. Okay, and then we have a question from Caleb. What's the difference between Vue and React? They're both UI libraries. They serve kind of a similar role. So React is built by Facebook. It's definitely the most popular UI front-end UI library these days, component-based, sort of revolutionized those ideas. Vue is a somewhat newer alternative. It's driven by the community, and a lot of people just like it's just different syntax. Some things a little bit different about it. But in practice, try both and see which one you like better. That'd be my recommendation. Another competitor in that space would be something like Angular is like the other big one. That one's more backed by Google. Okay, so let's actually get to building this. So the first thing we're going to want to do after you've downloaded this, yes, Vue is open source. All of it, basically, you'll find that most of the JavaScript and NPM ecosystem is all like MIT licensed, completely open source. So you're free to basically just use whatever you need, and there's not too many problems. So to actually get started on this, let's just take a look at the page and see what we already have. So you're going to want to, in your browser, you can just do like a Control-O or Command-O, and that'll give you the option to open up a file. So when you visit a web page, you're actually just opening a file. You're downloading a file from the web that's an HTML file, and you're opening it up. So to actually like view our local project, we can just go ahead here, head to our index.html, and just open that up. And you'll see, okay, here's the basic page with all the styling and stuff I've already given for you. Unfortunately, I just don't have a lot of time to go into like writing HTML and CSS. So it's pretty straightforward, and we do have other web development workshops that focus more on that, but I really want to focus on the JavaScript today. So you've already got these buttons like set up here, but if you click them, like you can see, like nothing happens. There's no image. Like, how does all of that happen? All right, so what we're going to need to do is actually add a script file. So if you look here in the HTML, you can see the buttons, right? You can see this image tag is where the image is going to be. And you'll see the script, that's where you load in our script. The name inside of this string here is what file you're going to be loading from. So usually you just call it like script.js or something, but you can of course name it, whatever you want, .js. So just go ahead and open up that file. It doesn't exist, so you have to make a brand new file. And let's just start out by doing like a simple hello world, just so you can see how JavaScript works and like some of the basic syntax. It's going to feel a lot like a Java or C# kind of language. Semicolons at the end of lines, standard sort of function things. And for printing, you use console.log. What did I just open up? So this is just my text editor. I use Vim. It's a text editor you can run like on the terminal, but just open up VS Code or Notepad or whatever you use. And just make a file called script.js. And then go ahead and add this line into it. So if we added this now, if you save that, then we'll have this JavaScript file, and you can see it's being loaded in right here. And then if we go back to our browser, so let's head back over to our browser, you want to open up your developer tools. So different browsers have different shortcuts for this, but if you always head over here, somewhere in your options, you should have an option for web developer tools. When you're writing JavaScript, you're going to be using this a lot. And then yours probably will dock at the bottom, so let me do that. You can set it, you can use the options. Most browsers will have an option like you can move it over to the right or wherever you want it to be, whatever makes it easy for you. All right, and then we'll need to reload this. Okay, so when you reload it, that will cause basically the whole page to re-render, and that's how you can like make sure that you're up to date with the latest thing. It's sort of like what you do instead of compiling and rerunning, you just refresh the page. So it's definitely very convenient. And then right here, you can see in our console, our browser console, we get this hello world printed out. Script.js, line 1. So that's where if you console.log things out, you'll actually find in the console. This exists on all websites. Like you can just head over, you can head over to GitHub. You can look at their thing. You can see they have some different stuff's being logged out over here. Every site has this. Sometimes it's kind of fun to poke around and see what different sites have. But that's just your basic print statement. That's mostly useful for debugging. So again, most users are not going to open up their browser console to see what you print out. They're going to want to interact with the page. So mostly you use console.log for debugging, but it's still like a very important statement to know. JavaScript has also variables. So like there's a few different ways you can declare variables. And it can get pretty confusing in JavaScript because there's like so many different options. So let's just show a few different examples of what you can do. All right, so like a lot of languages, you have different data types you can use. You'll have things like numbers, you also have strings for names, and then there's kind of 3 different ways you can declare variables. You've got the const keyword, the let keyword, and the var keyword. These days, var is recommended to not be used anymore. So in the beginning, JavaScript only had the var keyword, but it does have some problems. And so as a result, JavaScript's a living language. Like it's basically in every year they release a new version of JavaScript. So 6 times a year, TC39, which is it's a giant committee. It's an international organization where a bunch of like really smart people who love JavaScript come together and they talk about what new features can we add to JavaScript to make it better, what things can we fix that haven't worked so well, what situations can we clarify. And so they release a huge document. It's like 900 pages long that basically says, how does everything in JavaScript work? And then after that, the browser implementers, so like Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Edge, basically they go and they read this document and they use that based on that document. They're like, okay, console.log is supposed to do this. This is how addition is supposed to work. They go read that document and they actually implement the engine that runs JavaScript. So you actually have different implementations of JavaScript. That's why you'll see sometimes you'll run into issues sometimes where things work on one browser or not in another browser. That actually happened to me today. Just trying to get this hop-in set up. It actually was not running very well on Firefox, which is what I normally use. So I'd use Chrome instead, and it seemed to work much better. So just because of like incompatibilities between browsers or like different levels of support for things, there's different implementations. So just because you've written some JavaScript that works for you in your browser, you should test it in other browsers to make sure it works there as well. Okay, let me address the question in the chat. How did you open the console on the web page? Yeah, so you can do, there's a number of different shortcuts. They vary between browsers, but you can always for sure get there by just heading to one of these menus. And like it should be an option somewhere. It's usually called like web developer tools or developer tools, something like that. Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, you can also right click and inspect, and that will pop this open too, and you just head to the console. Okay, so that's how we print. Things like variables though are pretty well standardized. So like you're not going to be like, oh, declaring a variable doesn't work in this browser versus another browser. So one thing that's unique about JavaScript compared to languages you might know, it's for those of you who know Python, it's a lot like Python in the sense that things are dynamically typed. So for example, we declare this variable here, name equals Rob. It's a string initially. And you don't have to like say the type. So unlike something like Java, you don't have to say like string name, like that's not a thing you do. If you are interested in something like that, Typescript, we have a great workshop. Sunit ran a great workshop on Typescript a couple of weeks ago. Typescript is basically a Microsoft extension to JavaScript that does provide static typing if you're into that sort of thing. But regular JavaScript does not have that. So you could just, go and reassign a variable to a different type. It's probably a bad idea to do this, but you can do it. That's just the nature of JavaScript. It's dynamically typed. And then in terms of how you should declare your variables, there's different opinions about this, but generally the consensus is don't use the var keyword. So you'll see this a lot in older code, because like I said before, var has been around since the beginning, and const and let are things that have been standardized more recently in the past maybe 5 years. So because of that, sometimes you'll see older documentation still use var. And what you should do is don't just copy and paste it straight from the documentation, or if you do, make sure you swap out those vars for let. So basically anywhere you see var, it's pretty probable you're going to be able to switch to let. And there's a lot of benefits that you get, basically just in terms of like unintuitive things not happening. You can get some weird problems with var if you're not super sure how it works. So the modern standard is to use const and let. Let basically is just you can declare any variable with this keyword, and it also lets you change it later. So you can say, okay, I'm going to make, I'm going to change the name to something else. That'll work fine. Const, on the other hand, will not let you reassign the variable. So if you try to change the value of pi to like 5 or something, this will throw an error at runtime. So JavaScript's not a compiled language, just like Python. It all runs in the browser or on Node or whatever platform you're using. So a lot of times your errors are not going, there's no like compile step for errors to show up at, it'll just crash at runtime. So if you try to actually do this, that's what will happen. You'll get an error at runtime. In general, my recommendation is to always use const. So by default, declare things const. You might think, oh, what if I want to change things later? Well, you can always decide to change it to let if you realize you're going to change it. But the benefit of declaring everything with const, like if you declare everything by const, it's easy to see, okay, none of these things change. And then if you ever do have a let, then you know that, oh, it's fairly probable that this variable is going to change. So that's just a good practice in general. Declare everything with const, and then you know, okay, these aren't going to change. Use let, and that's like it's immediately an indicator to people. Like, oh, you see a let, that means it's going to change. Because otherwise, why would you mark it let? The other kind of modern camp is people would just say let is less letters, so just always use let. So you can do that, but I prefer to use the const way. I think most companies consider that the standard way. But there's different style guides. So just whatever you like the best or whatever style guide your organization uses is what you should follow. How did you open the console when you were writing? If you're talking about like right where we are right here, yeah, so this is just Vim. This is just a text editor. Just like if you have VS Code or whatever, Sublime Text, whatever you use, I'm just opening it. It's just opening up a text file. I just have kind of a very like a dark theme. So you just want to open up a file called script.js and type this stuff in there. For this, you don't need to follow along. We haven't actually really gotten into the major thing. The other thing we need to know about JavaScript is functions. So variables are pretty straightforward. You can declare them like that. There's also arrays. So like if you want to have a list of things, you can do that. You don't need to like do, unlike Java, you don't have to do array, or it's a lot like you would in Python. You're just able to declare an array straight away like that, which is very convenient. And then, the last major type you should know about is an object. So the JavaScript object is probably one of the more unique things about compared to other languages. It's a lot like a Python dictionary, or if you're familiar with Lua, different other scripting languages sometimes have similar things to this, but things like C and Java don't really have a real equivalent. It's sort of a hash type data structure. So basically it maps keys to values. So usually you use it to represent some kind of real world thing. So maybe we have a person and we're going to say this person has a name. So I'll make it me, and then they have an age, right? So I'm 19. And then what else we could have? Like we could have a hackathon that we're currently at. And maybe we have a favorite color. So I'll just put blue for now. Okay, so you could have something like this. Another thing to note, the common convention in JavaScript is to use Camelcase. So like snake case is not really the way you do things. Camelcase is the way to go for JavaScript. And for these objects, so once you've created this, it's like, okay, it's kind of interesting, but how do you actually use this? Well, let's say we wanted to log out like this 19 here. What you can do is you can do person.age. So all of these properties you can kind of think of as like they're subcomponents of this person. So it's kind of like a struct in a sense. In C, if that's something you're familiar with, or like a class, like you make an object in a class in Java. But it's definitely more powerful because you can do things like add new properties later. So if you want to add, maybe you want to add, I don't know, something like this, you can add properties later on, which is not really something you can do with other languages. It's a very flexible, very dynamic data structure. So there's a lot of things you can do. Final property followed by a comma. I'm not certain what you mean by that, but basically, yes, for you to declare things in here, you just say the property name, so property, and then a colon, and then the value, which can be another object. Like, so sometimes you'll see nested objects. You could have like an array, like maybe you'd have like things that I have or something like that. And you can have like an array of strings. Basically, it's a very flexible notation where you can describe a lot of data, different kinds of data structures very succinctly. So JavaScript objects are pretty cool. Okay, I want to get into functions, and then we'll actually be able to, we'll know enough that we'll be able to start putting together this site. Oh, yes. Is there some kind of sort of null in JavaScript? Yes. This is actually a pretty confusing situation in JavaScript. So there's sort of two like null values. You have just regular null. So you can say like, maybe just like you just use it just like you would in other languages. The best way to think of null is it's like an intentionally set thing. So most things are like not null by default. You set values to null. But JavaScript also has something called undefined. So actually, the easiest way to demo this is just to show you. If you have Node JS installed, you can just run Node and it'll open up like a live JavaScript REPL for you, a lot like you could in Python or other languages. So if you take an array, like let's say we make an array, right? So we have this array, and if we try to index a value, like there's nothing in this array. So like if we try to index some random number, it's not going to work. But in JavaScript, you actually don't get an error for doing this. You just get back this undefined value. So a lot of times you can also do like, we'll see this soon. Like if you do a function declaration, let's say we write a function to add two numbers. All right. If you pass in, like if you forget to pass in one of the arguments, it doesn't crash. You just undefined gets passed in instead. So there's sort of two different nulls in JavaScript. It's very confusing, but basically the distinction is null is like regular null, and that's usually something that you set. So somewhere, some code that somebody wrote is setting that. If you're getting undefined, it means that you're accessing something that doesn't exist, or it's kind of like a default in the language for things. But yeah, definitely super confusing. That's a good question. Okay. So if you want to make a function, let's get back to that. Declaring a function is very easy in JavaScript. You just type function, and then you type the name of the function, and then you type the arguments you want. And remember, since there's like no types for anything, you don't need to like put int or anything like that. In fact, like things can even be like sort of like polymorphic in a sense. So we could call sum with 2 numbers, but we could also call sum with 2 strings. Right? You could do something like this, and this will also work because plus works on both numbers and strings. And so this is perfectly fine. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, we have some more questions. On line 11, is the comma supposed to be there? Yes. So this comma, it's optional. So you don't have to put the comma there, but you can. The reason that usually people do is because it's for diffs. So if you go to the GitHub workshop, you'll see like how to use Git. And basically in version control, what you'll get is when you change a line, like if you do this and we add a new line, let's say we add this line here, then you have to put a comma here. And so in your diff, you'll see that both of these lines change, even though this first line, you really only added a comma. So usually people just preemptively add the comma. And then if you add a new line, only this line will show as a change in the diff. So that's kind of very like stylistic thing, but it's 100%, either way is completely compatible in JavaScript. Like you're not going to get errors by doing it either way. Okay. Did there not have to be semicolons? Yes. So there is something called automatic semicolon insertion in JavaScript. Basically, you don't have to have semicolons in most cases, but there's some weird edge cases that can result. What they come up as is if you try to do something like this, like, I don't know. So if you have a line where you don't end in a semicolon, and then you have like an open array literal on the next line, it will interpret it as an indexing expression of the previous thing, which is almost never what you actually mean and will be likely very confusing. Or if you do some kind of like parenthesis expression on the next line, then it will interpret this as a function call with the previous line if you don't put a semicolon, which is almost never what you actually mean. So there are some very confusing things that happen if you don't use semicolons, which is why most style guides recommend you do. However, you can leave them off as long as you know the edge cases. And if you get like any kind of like nice IDE, it will warn you if you try to do things like that. And it'll be like, don't do this, like bad things going to happen. Okay, let's see. Can you call sum on 2 objects? You can. I'm pretty sure it'll just blow up because addition is not like defined for just objects. So if you just like pass in 2 objects, like or arrays, like it doesn't work for arrays either. So yeah, basically plus is only going to work on certain things. You could always call it though and like see what happens. It's just going to blow up. Operator overloading is a thing, but not in JavaScript, at least currently, as far as I know. Okay, you mentioned the objects are similar to structs. Does this mean you can create variables of type person? So not really. That's the thing. So there's no types, right? JavaScript it's basically untyped. You can think of it like there's numbers and strings and things, but if you want to make another person, like what you would do is you would just declare a new object literal, and then you copy all the property name with the same property names, and you just do you can do change whatever things you want to do. Yeah, so there's no like specific types. You basically you can just declare a new object literal. There's also classes, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over that. But if you are used to a more class-based style, that is a thing. But I encourage you to learn how to do things kind of the object literal way, because that is sort of the more JavaScript native way, and it's definitely what makes JavaScript unique and super useful compared to other languages. Because in other languages, you usually do have to like go and declare a class for a person before you can, and then you like do a constructor and you'd pass in all the things. And it's just a lot of extra code. It's actually something that I find really nice about JavaScript. You can just declare these like kind of almost anonymous structs. It definitely feels weird, but you will get used to it and come to appreciate it if you write enough JavaScript. Okay, can you use some shortcuts for functions? Yes. Okay, let's finish declaring our functions here. And let me show you the other ways you can declare functions. So this is something else that confuses people a lot about JavaScript. There's a number of different ways you can declare functions. So the sort of like standard way is just you use the file what it is. Nowadays, a sort of more modern style is to use basically this Lambda expression. So this is what you'll likely see this, and I encourage you to write your code like this just to get used to it, because it's going to feel weird coming from most languages. this definitely, I think, will feel more natural. I encourage you to write your functions like this just so you get used to it. It's kind of interesting. Basically, what you do in JavaScript, functions are a first-class value. So just like you can declare a number, like you can say, okay, 3.14, that is a number literal. And then Rob, that is a string literal. This array here, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is an array literal. This is an object literal. You can declare a function literal. So like you can just make like, if we go pull up node, right? And then we just like, let's just declare a function. This is basically going to be some function. You can see this evaluates to function, an anonymous function, like it's a value. And that's something that many languages don't have. It's actually a fantastic feature for doing things. It's just super useful. But basically that enables you to write in this style. And so you'll see, and then also you'll see like weird combinations of this. So sometimes you'll see like an old code, you might see something like this. There's a whole bunch of variations. So you see they use the var keyword instead of const because they didn't have const. And this arrow function where you have an arrow instead of just using like regular function keyword, that's a newer addition too. They might do something like this. All of these are sort of equivalent ways to define a function. Something else, if you want to make a method, like if we want to add a method to this person, you can just assign a function straight to it. So like if we want to do like print name or something like that, you can just assign a function straight to this and then do something like this. So you'll sometimes see that as well in old code. If you're ever confused about syntax, like just ask someone who's more experienced or Google it, because JavaScript is a language that has evolved a lot over the years and it has all kinds of weird stuff like that. But the two styles you see these days are mostly these two things. This Lambda operator, I patched my own font just because I like having pretty arrows. But if I hover over it, you can see it's actually just an equal sign and a greater than. So put together, it looks like an arrow. And then my font, just whenever those are next to each other, it makes them into one character. But that's what that arrow is. Okay, so that's basically all you need to know about JavaScript to get started. There's, of course, tons and tons of more syntax, all kinds of different things. It's a very featureful language. So there's a lot of like great built-in stuff that you get beyond like something, I would say most other languages. You have a lot of really nice features. But okay, let's actually get into start writing the thing. Unless we have any more questions or any other like syntax people want to like see. How do you comment? That's a good question. It's Java style comments. So // for single line comment, and you can do multi-line comments with the star, the /*. Okay. So we are running a little bit behind time, but that's totally fine because we've had some great questions. What we're going to be building is, as we've seen, this food image sort of presenter. So I don't know where here's the one that was working, right? You can see the different images. Now, where are these images coming from? So you could just have like a whole pile of these images locally, but something that is like super useful, especially for hackathons and stuff like that, is using an API. So we're going to learn how to use an API. An API is basically just code somebody else wrote and provided over the internet. So you can basically send over the network, right, on your computer. Your computer can send a network request to a URL and get like an image sent back or get some text sent back or whatever, all kinds of different things. You can get random facts, random images. So this is actually an API I just found the other day. And the URL is just foodish-api.herokuapp.com/API. So let me send this in the chat. You can actually just go to this URL and you'll get like you go to this screen where it just seems like you have this link. But if you actually go to this link, you'll see it's just a random picture of some food. I was hungry when I made this. That's why it's all food. Plus the food images on this site are like really high quality for some reason. Okay. So what I usually do is basically define a constant for this. You can also do it like inline in other places, but it's nice to have it just at the top with the constant. So we're going to basically set up this URL into a constant. It's not going to change. And then you can actually get that data with something called the fetch API. So the fetch API is something that's provided only in your browser. So you're not going to be able to use it in Node. It's a browser API that lets you make a network request. So basically, you pass in a URL, and then you'll get back some data. The weird thing about JavaScript, though, is the asynchronous nature of this. So let's actually just log out what happens when we do this, and we'll sort of see the weirdness. All right, so let's over here. We open this up, let's reload. Okay, so when we log it out, we get back this promise state pending. Basically, a promise is JavaScript's way of representing a value that is like going to show up but hasn't arrived yet. So anytime you do like IO in JavaScript, like doing a network request, JavaScript is asynchronous, non-blocking, and single-threaded. What that means is, in comparison to other languages, like if you try to get some input from the console, or you make a network request in many languages, by default, what you'll get is basically sort of how you would expect. Like, okay, we're going to send a request to this URL, and then we're going to wait until the data shows up, right? And that's fine. You wait for the data to show up, and then you have the data, and then you can do what you want with it. The problem with this is, while you're waiting for the data to show up, you can't do anything else, which for some applications, it doesn't matter. But for other applications, it does. And especially for JavaScript, since there's only a single thread, and this is getting into parallel programming, which is a whole other thing. But basically, since there's only a single thread, if you make a synchronous request where you're a synchronous blocking request where you just make a request to the URL and you wait for it to show up, it'll freeze up the whole browser. So this actually happens on some older sites. Like you might see examples if you have like some really old sites. You'll notice, because a lot of older sites did do this, there used to be a synchronous API that everyone used for making network requests. The problem is, like, one, what if the server is really slow that day and it takes several seconds for it to show up? Or two, what if like, maybe the server's down? Like, what if the request just never comes back? Like you send it out and you just wait and you wait and you wait and you wait, and you frozen the entire UI up, nothing works, right? That's a terrible user experience. So that's why async became a thing. And JavaScript was really one of the languages that really revolutionized this. The idea of like asynchronous programming, promises or futures, they call it in some languages. Yeah, like Arjun says, lots of different languages use this now. Basically, everyone stole it from JavaScript because it's great. The weird thing about how async works, though, is, okay, so how do we actually like get the value out of this, right? So we're fetching this value, but how do we you can't just like assign it into a variable, because if you do that, you'll get a promise. You won't actually get the real data. So how do you get the data out? The main way you do this is with this method called .then. So the way .then works is instead of blocking and waiting for that data to show up, you say, okay, go make this request fetch. Like, I'm going to keep going, but like tap me on the shoulder when that data shows up, basically is how it works. And this .then is saying, okay, when you tap me on the shoulder, what do you want to do? So what goes inside here is a function. So you can just define a function, and we'll say, okay, we get the data in. And what you initially get is a blob, kind of like try catch. Not quite. It depends exactly what you mean by that. Basically, the first thing you need to do when you get a request back, you'll just get a blob of data, and it will not have any format to it. So it could be like binary data for like an image. It could just be plain text, or it could be something called JSON. JSON stands for a JavaScript Object Notation. It's the dominant format for text interchange over the internet. So anytime you see JSON or you see like a website, oh, you can go to this API, it'll give you JSON back. Even if we go to that API we were looking at, right? Where did it go? I think I closed it. Yeah, you can see we're getting back JSON. So the reason it's called JavaScript Object Notation is because it looks just like a JavaScript object. So you see, look, there's our open, you probably can't see it, it's so small, but there's our open brace, and then we have a key and we have a value. So yeah, JSON is great. It's pretty easy to work with, especially in JavaScript, super nice. Yeah, you can use XML. There's other formats, but JSON is better. So that's why everyone uses JSON for the most part. So what we need to do, though, is actually say, hey, we're expecting the data we get back to be JSON. So that's what the first thing we'll do is. And then after that, we can chain another .then, and we'll have the real data. So something like this. and we'll say, okay, we get the real data in this function, and then we can just log it out. So let's do that. All right, and then if we reload this, should see. Oh, you know what? Oh, we didn't actually. Yeah, JavaScript is actually really bad about errors. If you like do something wrong, usually it just says nothing or does the wrong thing. So you definitely have to like Google the errors, learn what they mean because it's tough. Okay, so we can see here we get this object back, and we have this image property here that has basically a link to the actual image. So that's what we're getting back. Now, doing this kind of thing where you define these functions like this is kind of a pain. Because like every time you want to do network requests, you have to define like 2 functions. That's super annoying. So that's where the idea of like these anonymous functions comes in. And this is where it's probably going to be not like really any other languages used before. What you can do is in here, you can just declare like a short version of the function. So maybe the best way to sort of see this, let's rewrite these to be the const style. So we say, okay, when we get the data, it's really just a function that takes blob and returns blob.json. And something that's useful about arrow functions is you can drop these, right? These braces. If you can drop the set of braces and the return if you just have like a short expression. So if you don't have multiple lines, you just want to do it all in one shot, you don't need that. And if you only have one parameter, you can also drop this. So this is actually a very compressed way to write this. So now when you see it this way, hopefully you can kind of see when we get the data is not just a function, but it's also a value, right? It's basically just the value here. And a lot like you could do something like, let's say we have a sum function, right? And we could do, okay, we do a plus b, right? We can say, okay, a equals 5, b equals 5, and we can pass in those arguments like this. Well, it's just the same thing as saying this, right? You see how these 2 approaches, you can do it like this, but you can also just do it like this. There's no need to give those variables a name. So you have the same thing with this whole function thing. We can say, okay, we have this function we're passing in here. Why do we even need this variable? We can just take this and drop it straight in there. And this is generally the preferred style to do things. And so for this one, we can do the same thing. We can say, just call this function. We're not even going to give it a name. And we'll just pass in that. And then usually people will format it like this to make it look a little bit nicer. All right, so hopefully that makes some sense. So you'll see this sort of idea of having these anonymous arrow functions, and you can see that shortens things up dramatically. So this is one way to do fetch. The other way that's very popular is something called async await. And async await basically is just syntax sugar on top of promises. So it uses promises under the hood. Basically, inside the browser, it gets sort of, you can think of it as just getting converted into this. But it has a syntax that a lot of people like. And basically what you do with async await is you can say, you can write your code like here. So let's go down here. So this is the promises way. So if you've heard of promises, this is the promises way. And then this is async await. So if we want to get the blob, we can say, okay, blob is just awaiting the fetch from that food URL. And then if we want to get the data, we can say, okay, we're going to do blob.json, and we're going to await that. So this is and then we could just do console.log data like this. The only thing about async await you have to worry about is you have to be inside of an async function to use it. So this is the other way you'll see it done. In JavaScript, is a language where there's usually a lot of different ways to get things done, and you'll see different methods. So you kind of have to do your research to figure out like what is the more modern, conventional way. These days, async await is considered usually the most modern way to do things if you can. But you can also like, it's also possible to do a hybrid. I do a hybrid way a lot. So what I'll do is basically do this. And so you can kind of do half and half. And that way, because I don't like having this like blob variable just floating around. So you can do this, you can mix and match, because at the end of the day, it's all the same thing. Okay, so let's stick with that. We have this. So how do we actually, so we can log this out if we run this. Let's just run this to make sure it's still working. Oh, okay, so we're actually getting an error. Await is only valid in async functions, right? So what we can do is just make an async like main function and put everything inside of it, and then call that. So the way you make an async function is you just put async in front of it. You can also declare it this way. So if you want to do it this way, you can do that as well. Okay, and now that should cause that to go away. And there we go. And you see it takes a second because it takes time for these network requests to happen. Okay, so we have this image and we're getting this URL back for it. How do we actually display that to the screen? So now we're going to interact with something called the DOM. The DOM stands for the Document Object Model, and basically it's a way to talk to our HTML from JavaScript. So if we open up our HTML file, I know we haven't been looking at it a lot. I'm going to put it on the top and then our JavaScript on the bottom here. You'll notice I've added a number of IDs to the various elements. So these IDs are a way to hook, that's how we're going to be able to hook into our HTML from JavaScript. And the way you do that usually is I usually just do it at the top. You can use a function called document.queryselector. So basically, like let's say we want to get a reference to this image right here. So you say, okay, our image is going to be document.queryselector, and then you pass in a string where the string is a hash followed by the ID. So in this case, I just made the ID. You can see right here, it's just image. So pass in the hash ID there. There we go. And you can also grab, so we have a div. Div is just kind of a general container you can use for whatever. So I call this one loading, and then we have 2 buttons as well. So I'll get the code for that. Button 1, button 2, and okay. So we have our buttons, and what these do is now we're going to be able to interact with those and set values for them in our code here. So instead of just logging our data, we also would want to take that data and set our image to actually display as that. And so if you actually have used HTML before, the way you give, if you just want to have an image that's always the same, you can just put in a URL in a string here and in this source property, and that's how it knows where to get the image from. But if you want to dynamically set one, you have to use JavaScript. So here you can just say, okay, we're going to take our image and then just set image.source equal to that data. Our only problem is that our data is actually still in the JSON format, right? So it's actually this object. And so if you want to actually access value in that object, there's sort of a few different ways. One way is you can just do dot. So we can see in this case, that property, that key property is image, right? You can see here, it's showing it. We have an object and it only has one property. That property is image. So you can just do dot image. You can kind of look it up like an array. So you can do this. Usually people don't do this, but it's useful if you want to put a variable in here. If you're going to use some dynamic value, you can do that. And then the other thing you can do is called an object destructure. So the way this works, it's sort of like a one-to-one matching. So this probably will look strange if you're from other languages. But if you can think okay, if we think about what's inside data, data is image and then, something like that, right? That's what's inside this variable. So you can think of okay, basically what we're doing is data is that value. And then what's on the right has to match with what's on the left. And so it'll say, okay, image on this side equals this. So image on this side will equal that. And then image, this value over here, we should probably do something else like some other variable name, maybe image URL. So what this will do is say, okay, take the image value from the right side, which is this string, and store it into image URL. And then we can do it like that. If that's confusing, look into it. People use it sometimes, but just so you're aware, this is one of those powerful syntax extensions you get with JavaScript. For now, I'm just going to do data.image. That's kind of the most straightforward. Question. Okay. What would you do if you have class instead of ID? Okay, yeah. So sometimes you have classes for CSS classes. You can just these query selector works just like a CSS selector, familiar with that. So to select an ID, you use the hash. To select the class, you just use the dot. I just get rid of the image. No. So the image, so there's an image tag right here, and then right here is where we get access to that. So you see the ID is image here, and then right here we have hash image, and that's stored into this variable called image. And then we're going to set that image source to our data with the URL. Yeah. Okay. So this should work. If we reload this, you can see, oh wow, this is a great picture. You can see that it's able to do that and renders it in. And if we change that source later, it will render to be something else. So we are running a little bit short on time. So what I'm going to do is let's implement the buttons, and then I'll run over a little bit for people who want to learn how Node works. And you can always take a look at the whole source code at the end. Okay, so if we want to make the buttons work, buttons are an very event-driven thing. So they work. This is another like sort of JavaScript weirdness that you'll have to get used to. It's going along with this whole asynchronous non-blocking API, right? For a button, you might think, look, how do you implement a button? Because when you think about a button, right? Like say you're trying to write it in C, you probably would do something like, okay, let's just do a while loop and like check, was the button clicked? Was the button clicked? Was the button clicked? And just do an infinite loop and just keep checking if the button was clicked. And then once clicked, you know, okay, now we can do whatever we need to do. That's what you might do if you were like the low-level libraries. Ultimately, that's usually they work something like that. But JavaScript gives you a high-level API. And what it lets you do is add something called an event listener. So if you do this, add event listener function is available on like most different like elements you can get. So you can use it for images or anything, but we're going to use it for our button 1. So, or let's start with button 2, because button 2 is our next button. So first you pass in the first argument says what kind of event is it. So we're going to listen for click event. You can also listen for like keyboard event or drag event. Basically, any kind of UI interaction, you're going to be able to listen, like even hover, store, all kinds of things. And then the second argument is a listener, right? So you can see the documentation popping up here. Basically, it's a function. So if we want to declare like, and again, this is that anonymous function, right? We're going to say, okay, we don't need to give this a name. Just say when we do a click, run the code that's inside of this block. And so what are we going to do for the block? Well, we want to go do another fetch, right? And then we want to set that image again. And that's how we're able to set a brand new thing. You can just copy that over. We could also consider like extracting this to like, maybe we could say this could be like update image or something. Call this function update image. And then we wouldn't even need to like copy all this in here because it's just the same function. We could just say update image. That's another way you can do things. And so now every time we click the button, it's going to trigger this function to be called. So initially we set up, we're going to grab all these references, we're going to define this update image function, and we're going to say, hey, whenever button 2 gets clicked, call this function for me. And then we're also just going to call it once just to set up the initial thing. Now we call it once to set the initial. Oh, okay. That's all loaded. Can you go back to the picture of the strawberries? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't think I can get back to it. But never fear. Just make a bunch of requests to this API. You'll eventually get the same one again. There's actually like a lot of really nice pictures. Like, so if we click through these, like there's a lot of like really like it just looks so delicious. That's why I picked this API. Pizza Hut. Yeah, I can only shuffle through. So the previous, what I was doing for the previous is you could basically, that's not important. I'm going to kind of skip over that. But the way that would work is you basically do the same thing. And then you would write a function that like, what you want to do is store like all the previous, you'd store all the previous URLs into an array and then like keep index variable. And then use that to look up. You can read the final source. So if you actually go to GitHub, the final source is available. You can just head down to final, and that's kind of like the final cleanup version that has all of that implemented. You can take a look at that. But what I want to do now at the very end here is quickly take a look at what Node looks like. So this is all front end. If you like doing this, like you like this idea of being able to do these click listeners and like interact with APIs, this is all This is all front-end code. The other thing you can do with JavaScript, at least another main use of it is write a backend. So to do that, we're going to install something called Express. Express.js is basically a JavaScript library that makes it easier to set up a backend. You can like write up all the code manually yourself, but using Express is like super convenient. So that's what we're going to be doing. And basically what Express is useful for is writing APIs. So let's say you wanted, like, how does this image API work, right? If we go to, oh, it's gone now. So if we go back to this site, like, let's say we wanted to make this. How could we make something like this where like you go to this site and it just sends you back JSON? Like, how would you build something like this? That's what you can do with Node.js or a backend. So let's take a look at that. Basically what you'll see, the way you can sort of tell you're in Node is you'll usually see this something called a require. So JavaScript, again, being a language used for many things, it sort of has multiple import systems. This is 100% just because it's used for multiple things. On the front end, you'll usually see import statements. So you see, it kind of looks like Python. You'll get like import, some module from. You'll usually see something like this. This is what you'll get in front end, like on a React project or something. When you see this require, so this is something called ES imports. So if you see this and you're confused, go look up ES imports, ES modules. And that's what this is all about. When you're writing Node, though, you usually use require. So this is like a common JS thing. Basically what happened is require was invented first and before there was any module system in JavaScript, and then they added import later. So, but still both are commonly used. So require, it works in a very similar way. You just call this require function and then assign the result into a variable, and that's kind of your library. Now you've imported whatever Express is into this variable. And then to set up a basic Express app, you just call this. Express is actually a function, so you can just call it. And then basically you want to set up Express to listen on a given port. So like, for example, I'm just going to use 3000, but you can listen on whatever port you want. Networking ports, basically, if you're not familiar, your computer has many different ports that you can connect to. Like 8080 is used for secure connections. 3000 is commonly used for like testing. So that's all that means. It goes in your URL. You'll see in a minute how it works. And then what we do is we can set up different paths on our API. So the most basic request you can do is a GET request. And let's just have a request for the basic slash. And then what we do is this, again, you've seen this anonymous function idea, this asynchronous programming idea. It's the same thing. We're going to say, OK, give us a function to call when someone tries to make a request to just this /. And so we could just do something like, let's log out hello. So this is Node.js. OK, and so if we run this backend.js file, and the way you run it is just by running Node. And if this doesn't work on your system, then you need to install Node.js. You can just head to nodejs.org, just grab this latest current release, and you'll be good to go. And you'll see like nothing happens. And that's because it's waiting for you to make a request. And so to actually make a request, like you can just navigate there in a browser. So by default, when you just set this up, it's going to host on your local host. So it's something called localhost. And then you'll see you'll need to do :3000. And that's how you're making a request to the server. And so we're loading this. And you can see it prints that out. So we know that code is run. But in our browser, we don't get anything sent back. So how would we do that? Well, here we can do basically these two variables that we're getting passed in here. The REQ is the request, and then RES is for the response. Those are sort of like well-known shorthands. So we just do response.send, and then we can send back just a string. So we could just send back hello, for example. If we do that, and then reload this, you see, oh, we got hello back. But if you want to send JSON, this is where that object literal notation comes in handy. You can use, basically, you want to send like an object. So say we want to send an object with some data, something like this. And then, but you have to send it as a string. So you call json.stringify. And that will convert this into a string. And so if we run this and then reload this, you'll see, okay, we got a string back that has the key and the value in it. And that's fundamentally how these APIs work. And so you can do arbitrary things. So what's happening in this API is basically they have a server that's back there that has all of these images, and it just picks a random image and sends it back. And so that's fundamentally how it works. And so writing a server, like usually anytime you need to store data, for many projects, you don't need a backend. But if you want to build something complex, in all probability, all the interesting stuff will be happening on the backend. So this is where you're going to, if you want to do like an e-commerce kind of thing where you sell stuff online, then all the payment processing, all that stuff is going to be happening on the backend where you're sending requests and stuff like that. So that's a basic Node.js sort of demo. I was going to set it up so you could in the finalized one, take a look at that code. Basically, I use that basically querying that information. So having it send back a random. Actually, here we can just go see. So you can see sort of what was the final thing was supposed to look like. So we run this, and then we head to localhost 3000. Let's see. I don't remember if there was something. Oh, I need to maybe open. Oh, I think support to 8080. So, okay, so if we run that, the 8080 here. Okay, so this is sort of what the finalized project would be. And this little message here, I was just randomly generating in Node. So when you click next, this part is coming from that API someone else is hosting, but this part is coming from our own API. And the code for that is pretty straightforward. I just have an array of all of those things and then randomly pick one out. So sort of, hopefully that gives you an idea of how you would be able to use JavaScript on the front end, on the back end. You can also use it for mobile through something like React Native. It's really a very versatile language you can do a lot with. And so, yeah, hopefully that, I know it's probably kind of definitely a whirlwind kind of tour. You get to see all the different things, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what all the different JavaScript things are for and how you can use them. With that, I'll take any questions because I'm already 10 minutes over, and I'm sure there's other workshops that people want to be heading to. I can totally stick around though, so I don't know if people have questions or whatever. Let me know if you want to see how something was worked out, or you just have weird questions about JavaScript. Has all kinds of weird corner stuff and weird syntax. So yeah. I think, let's see, the Python workshop's probably over by now, but sure, I think there is something else coming up, maybe a web development. I actually don't know. I probably should know what the schedule has on it. Okay, thank you. Yes, you're all very welcome. I love doing workshops, and I definitely will be doing some in the future. So come out to our Night Hacks meetings and watch. I want to do a couple more workshops in the future. I don't have any more at this hackathon, unfortunately. I will be watching the mentorship channels though, so if you have questions, feel free to send it out. I'm awesome. I like to think so. Thank you. Should we have a license in our projects? Yes. So I have a great talk about this. Then there are lots of great talks about this online. Having a software license is super important. You probably noticed it's one of the first things I add to any project. Basically, by default, if you just post software to GitHub, a lot of people think you just post it to GitHub, that makes it open source. But this is not true. And it's not like people are debating this. It's actually if you go to the law or ask any lawyer, straight up, posting code on GitHub doesn't make it open source. If you write code, it's just like if you write a book or you produce some kind of work of art or music, anything like that, it's considered a creative work. And so what that actually means is you have full copyright control over that, and no one else is allowed to make copies of it, distribute it to other people, or even modify it without committing copyright infringement. So technically, you could sue people if they use your code you post on GitHub that doesn't have a license. So for that reason, you should always use a software license unless you intend to retain copyright and you actually want that. And if you do intend to retain copyright, you should put a copyright notice in your repository. So if that's the case, that's fine. Like there's many good reasons not to put it under an open source license. But if that's the case, make it clear that's what you're doing, because that way it also make your legal case easier if you do plan to sue someone. If you just put no license on it, now it's technically it's copyright, but like it's very confusing. It doesn't really show. A lot of people will just assume it's open source. So yeah, in this case, like I use for all my workshops, I use a very liberal license called 0BSD. It basically is the closest thing that you can do to putting it in the public domain. So yeah, I mean, you can actually read this license. You can use, copy, modify, distribute this software for any purpose with or without fee. And then this is just the reason it's all capitalized is according to the law, you have to capitalize everything to make it extra clear that you're disclaiming all the warranties. So yeah, don't sue me for like, if this software blows up your computer, it's not my fault. You ran it of your own volition, et cetera, et cetera. You think that this would never happen, but just put on a license. So if it does happen, then you're not going to get sued for thousands of dollars, because it only has to happen once to be very unfortunate. Arjun says, don't forget the type form. Oh yes, there's a tab for that, I believe. Basically, it's some kind of survey, I think. So they're trying to collect data about like what workshops people liked and what they liked about it or something like that. So yeah, do fill that out. Let's see. Yep, there is a workshop recording of me talking about licenses. I could talk about licenses for a whole nother like hour and a half. But just go watch my workshop, or maybe I'll do it again if people are interested. You can also just DM me questions. Okay, Blake, what kinds of computations belong to front end versus back end? For example, randomly generating strings from an array could just be done on the front end. Yes, that's very true. So my example is like, this is a super contrived example. You're right. Like there's nothing about this that needs to be on the back end. I just wanted to show you how it works. You could do this on the front end, it's not a problem. The reason you want to have a back end is if you want to keep this secret. So let's say if you want to manage like user data, for most applications, you're going to have user accounts where like you need to store a password or a hash of a password. You need to store like say you're writing like, I don't know, like tax software or something like that. So you need to store people's all this like critical financial information and social security numbers and stuff like that for people. And so how are you going to be like, you need to be able to have a login functionality where people can log in to the site, but it also needs to be the case that people aren't able to just read everyone else's social security numbers. So actually, I forget, this is in the news recently. There was some state where they were doing this. Instead of using a backend, they were just sending people's social security, like a whole array of like all the social security numbers over the wire, and then just checking against that array. Yeah, so this is an example of what not to do. Yeah, so that's why you would use a backend. If you have secret information, basically, or if you need persistent storage. So if you have secret information, that's one reason. You can keep it on the server, and then you can have like people basically send you their login info. And then once you know that they're authenticated and they're the right person, you can send them only the data relevant to them back. And all the data will live on your server, but no one else has access to that. It's just you. So that it keeps the data safe. That's one reason. And then the other reason is if you need persistent data. So say you're doing like an email server, or you just want to store information about like a user's profile or the options they've chosen or shopping history or whatever, right? When I shut down my computer and the browser is gone, all the front end code dies. Like, you know, they close the tab. It's like, boom, your front end code is no longer rendering. How do you remember things that already happened? You send a request to a backend and you just never shut down the backend ever. Or if you do server maintenance, and that's why things go down, because people shut down the server, they do maintenance, they update things, whatever, then they turn it back on, and that's why the services stop working for a while. So yeah, that's sort of an example of why you would want to do that. Okay. Sabrina says, hi, Rob. Victoria mentioned the hop-in workshop has been set to end at 10:15, so it may kick you out. Well, it's 10:15. I haven't been kicked out yet. Thanks, Victoria, for trying to extend it. Yeah, I appreciate that. So Amazon would never store people's information on the front end. Right. Basically, any kind of information you want to store on the back end. Like, so when you register for Night Hacks, what happened is you filled out the form, right? You clicked submit, and that sent a request to our backend, which stored all of that information. That way, no one else has access to it. And like, if we wanted to implement a login system, then instead of sending everything, because the front end, the front end is all code that's being sent to every single person who visits that site. So you can't put anything that's like specific to a user until you've authenticated and know that it's them. And you can't put anything that's like, the front is ephemeral, like it's gone. When the tab is closed, it can't run anymore because it runs on your local computer. And so people shut down their local computers, well, maybe some people don't. I don't know. Some people leave their tabs open forever, but people will shut that stuff down. And so in that case, you're not going to be able to use the front end for anything like that. If you need, like say you're doing a social media app, if someone posts a picture, you might be like, okay, you could just have it on the front end, but then how does it get to other people's computers? What happens when they close the app or they shut down their desktop? You still want people to be able to post and view. You still want people to be able to view and like comment or like on those photos. So they have to be stored in the back end, which is always on and can serve it out to everybody. Okay. I mean, it still hasn't kicked me out. So if there's more questions, I'm happy to continue answering. Otherwise, I thought there's another workshop that's coming up. Oh yeah, there's introduction to web development. Looks like there's not very many people in it. Hop into that with Aileen. That's probably where I'm going to be heading. And she'll kind of teach you like some of the HTML and CSS stuff that I glossed over. If you have questions, you can always ping me in Discord. I'll be running workshops in the future too, so come out to those. And good luck at the hackathon, everyone. Where can we see the final code from the workshop? So it's at that GitHub URL that I sent. This is the last thing I'll do. And then if you head to the final branch, so head to this URL, and then if you see this drop down here, you can head to final. And the final has all the code that's finalized. Yep. Okay. Yep. Mark's got a link to it too. Okay. Rob out. See y'all.